NBA YoungBoy's health problems have completely changed the way he lives. After dealing with a serious health scare that had fans concerned, YoungBoy has made some major changes to his life and even started looking at his career differently. Let me break it down. Before any of the legal drama, before the federal charges piled up, there was a moment that made fans stop scrolling. It came from an account that wasn't even his. It was his cat's. Back in the summer of 2023, a set of photos hit the Instagram page for Kentrell's cat, Neon. One picture showed him posing with the animal, nothing unusual there. But the caption underneath is what made people pause. Written from the cat's perspective, it said his dad had been looking unhealthy. It's scary. Even his mental. He blows his money making people smile, who don't care to see the signs that's literally in their face. The post ended with a plea for help. Then the comments got darker. The same account followed up, claiming he'd been pissing out blood for 2 days straight. That single line spread across hip-hop blogs within hours. Nobody could confirm it clinically. Nobody had a diagnosis attached to it, but the image stuck. A young father barely out of his 20s, allegedly bleeding internally while stuck inside a house he wasn't legally allowed to leave. That house was in Utah. He'd been placed there under 24-hour lockdown since October 2021 after catching a weapons charge, and by late 2023, he'd been confined for almost 2 full years. Court filings from his attorney described exactly what that isolation was doing to him. His lawyer, James Manasseh, told the court that being confined to his home and unable to complete his employment obligations has led to great anxiety, depression, loss of weight, and sleep. Manasseh added that his client has been visibly stressed and has expressed concern and loss of hope that he will be able to return to his contracted employment obligation. That's not a fan theory. That's a filing submitted to a judge. The weight loss wasn't subtle either. People who'd followed him since he was a teenager, posting freestyles out of Baton Rouge, could see it in every new photo drop. A frame that used to look sturdy on stage now looked stretched thin. And the isolation wasn't helping. Under the terms of his release, he could only see visitors a judge had pre-approved. He was prohibited from leaving his Utah home and was limited to 3 judge-approved guests. 3 people. For 2 years, no studio sessions, no video shoots, no walking outside for air without permission. The rapper's house arrest terms permitted only limited leave from home, hindering his music recording, video shoots, and public appearances, the essential parts of his career. He tried to push back on it publicly. When he sat down on the $1 Million Worth of Game podcast with Gilly Da King and Wallow, he talked about the loneliness, and he was asked directly whether he'd consider therapy. He admitted he had gone once, but it was court-mandated, not his choice. "Yeah, I seen one before," he said. "It was court-ordered. I'm not finna talk to somebody when you ain't been through stuff I have been through." That refusal matters because it tells you something about how he was actually coping, or not coping with everything piling on top of him. No outside help, no outlet besides music, and a body that was visibly showing the wear. Around the same period, a different kind of rumor started circulating, one about a herpes diagnosis. It became a running joke across TikTok and hip-hop forums, with clips of him addressing it directly in interviews, getting clipped and reposted for years afterward. Whether the specifics were ever medically confirmed publicly is beside the point. What mattered to fans watching from outside was the pattern. Weight dropping, skin issues showing up in photos, a limp that had people speculating online about nerve damage or an old injury flaring up. None of it added up to a single tidy diagnosis. All of it added up to a young man whose body looked like it was under siege. At the exact moment, his freedom was being stripped down to almost nothing. And then, just as the house arrest saga dragged into its 3rd year, everything got worse. New charges came down in Utah. A prescription fraud case, dozens of counts, allegations that he'd been running an operation to obtain controlled substances illegally. The affidavit named him directly, accusing him of posing as a physician to fill prescriptions for promethazine with codeine, the drug at the center of what's commonly known as lean, across multiple pharmacies in the Cache County area. It was the kind of case that read less like a rapper's mistake and more like a man trying to self-medicate his way through a health situation nobody outside his inner circle fully understood. That's the version of him people saw right before he went to prison. Thin, isolated, allegedly bleeding, allegedly self-medicating, refusing therapy, and about to trade one form of confinement for another, a federal one this time. The plea deal that sent him to federal prison came together at the end of 2024. He admitted to having a Glock 21 while filming a music video in Baton Rouge, and to keeping a Sig Sauer 9mm at his home in Huntsville, Utah. In exchange, prosecutors agreed to a sentence that read almost like a mercy deal on paper, 23 months, with credit going back to May of that year. But the reality of doing that time inside FCI Talladega, a federal facility in Alabama, was a different story entirely. Prison is not a place designed to help someone who's already dealing with anxiety, depression, and physical decline. It strips away routine, replaces it with rigid structure, and puts a person who's spent years avoiding therapy into an environment with almost zero privacy and almost zero control. For someone who'd already told a national podcast audience that he didn't trust anyone who ain't been through what he'd been through, that's about as isolating a setup as you can build, and it didn't take long for trouble to find him there. Reports surfaced claiming he'd been placed in solitary confinement after a physical altercation with another inmate. According to Terrence "Gangsta" Williams, a Louisiana street figure and half-brother of Cash Money's Birdman and Slim, the fight started after another inmate reportedly shouted OTF at him, a reference to Lil Durk's Only the Family collective and the long-running rivalry between the two camps. According to reports circulating online at the time, he knocked down the inmate after being triggered by the remark, leading to the altercation. The result, multiple sources claimed, was time in the hole. No official Bureau of Prison statement ever confirmed the specifics. But the story spread fast across hip-hop media, adding another layer to an already tense stretch behind bars. Solitary confinement isn't just a disciplinary tool. It's medically understood to accelerate mental health decline in people who already carry trauma or anxiety disorders. For a man who just spent 2 years describing his own hopelessness to a judge, weeks of isolated lockdown inside a federal prison were never going to be neutral. If anything, they were the exact kind of stressor his legal team had spent years trying to warn courts about. Physically, prison brought its own problems too. Access to consistent medical care inside federal facilities is notoriously inconsistent. And someone already dealing with weight fluctuation, skin issues, and reports of internal bleeding doesn't get better care behind a fence. He typically gets less. There's no evidence he received any specialized treatment while incarcerated for whatever had caused the earlier health scares. What is documented is that, as part of his sentencing, the court built in specific conditions clearly designed around concerns for his well-being once he got out. Mental health evaluations and substance abuse counseling, drug and alcohol screenings, all mandated as part of his 5 years of supervised release. That's not standard for every gun case. Courts don't typically build in mental health counseling requirements unless there's a documented pattern the system is trying to address. Even from inside, though, the music didn't stop. He dropped a mixtape called More Leaks while serving his sentence, built from unreleased tracks and old snippets, keeping his name in rotation, even while he had zero ability to promote it himself. That's always been part of his story. The productivity never fully stops, even when everything else around him is falling apart. It's almost a survival mechanism at this point. Studio time, even remotely managed, became the one place where he had some form of control, while his body and his freedom were both being managed by other people. By early 2025, word started leaking that his release was coming faster than the original paperwork suggested. Prison records had his official release date listed for April 26, but chatter from people inside his circle, mixtape collaborators, label associates, even commentators like DJ Academics, started suggesting a transfer was already underway. Nobody had official confirmation yet, but something was clearly moving. What nobody could have predicted was just how different the man walking out of that facility would look compared to the one who walked in. Whether that had to do with sobriety, structure, forced routine, or simply time away from the chaos of his old environment, the shift was about to become the biggest storyline of his year. Bigger, in some ways, than the charges themselves. The morning the news broke, it spread across social media before any official prison record had even updated. A member of his own crew, Never Broke Again affiliate OG33, posted a photo with him and said simply that he was finally back home. Commentator DJ Academics amplified it within hours, telling his audience the artist had either already been transferred to a halfway house or was headed straight home. At that point, FCI Talladega's own inmate database still listed his release date as weeks away. The paperwork hadn't caught up to the reality. What had actually happened was a transfer from the federal facility in Alabama to a residential reentry management office in Phoenix, Arizona. These offices operate the halfway houses that manage detainees as they prepare for supervised home confinement, easing someone back into normal life instead of just opening a gate and letting them walk into the world unsupervised. It's the step most high-profile releases go through quietly. His, predictably, did not stay quiet. Within weeks, reports started circulating that his Utah property now had armed guards patrolling it. That detail alone told its own story. A man who'd already survived an FBI pursuit years earlier, who'd been the target of long-running rivalries in the rap world, coming home to a level of security that looked less like celebrity paranoia and more like a real, calculated response to real threats. According to people close to his camp, he was under a curfew for the first 30 days home and required to stay at a specific, undisclosed location while the terms of his supervised release settled into place. That supervised release wasn't loose. 5 years of it, with drug and alcohol screenings built into the schedule, mental health evaluations required at set intervals, and substance abuse counseling sessions he couldn't skip without violating the terms of his freedom. Travel needed a parole officer's sign-off. Every move, in some sense, was now being tracked by a system that had spent years watching him spiral and was determined not to let it happen again on their watch. And yet, for the first time in years, something about the man himself looked different. Fan-run accounts that track him closely began posting side-by-side comparisons of his face from a few years back versus the man walking out in 2025 and into 2026. One widely shared post described the shift directly, noting that he appeared healthier and further removed from the heavier substances he'd reportedly been using during his house arrest years. It wasn't a medical report, it wasn't a doctor's note, but it was the first time in a long stretch that the public conversation about his appearance wasn't laced with concern, it was laced with relief. Part of that shift almost certainly traces back to Structure Prison, for all its damage forced a routine onto a man who'd spent years bouncing between isolation, paranoia, and self-medication inside a house he wasn't allowed to leave. Federal custody doesn't allow lean, doesn't allow the pill combinations that had defined his darkest stretches, doesn't allow the kind of unsupervised access to substances that fueled the Utah prescription. Fraud case in the first place. Whatever damage incarceration does to a person's mental state, it also, almost accidentally, removed him from the exact environment that had been killing him slowly. His family reunion, played out mostly behind closed doors, which itself marked a change, where the house arrest years had been documented obsessively. Court filings, leaked cat account captions, paparazzi-style photos of his physical decline. His actual return home was handled with far more control statements. Came through representatives. Photos, when they surfaced, were curated. The chaos of the last 5 years had clearly taught somebody in his camp a lesson about managing information, even if it came at the cost of transparency fans had gotten used to by the middle of 2025. Talk of a tour had already started circulating, with people inside his orbit hinting that new music and live dates were locked in. For an artist who'd spent almost his entire adult career recording from inside a house he legally couldn't leave, the idea of stepping back onto an actual stage in front of an actual crowd represented something bigger than a career milestone. It represented proof that the body everyone had watched deteriorate for years was still standing, still moving, still capable of doing the one thing that had made him famous in the first place. So, what does day-to-day life actually look like for him now? On the other side of all of it, it starts with the house itself. The same Utah property that once symbolized total confinement now sits behind a visible security presence, armed personnel patrolling the grounds around the clock. That's not a lifestyle choice made for image. Given his history with federal pursuits, gang-affiliated rivalries, and a documented pattern of threats tied to his OTF-related conflicts, the guards represent a level of real physical caution that most artists his age simply don't need. Inside that security perimeter, though, the picture looks less like a fortress and more like a family compound. He spent years fathering children across multiple relationships. Reports have tracked him welcoming his 10th child in recent years, each one adding to a household that's as much about domestic life now as it is about music. That's a meaningful shift in framing. The man once defined almost entirely by legal troubles and health scares is now, functionally, a father managing a large household with supervised release conditions stacked on top of ordinary parenting logistics. The counseling requirements haven't gone away, even with the walls of the prison behind him. Mental health evaluations and substance abuse counseling remain built into his 5 years of supervised release, meaning the same system that once documented his decline is now actively monitoring his recovery. Drug and alcohol screenings aren't optional. They're scheduled, mandatory, and tied directly to his continued freedom in a strange way. The system that failed to catch his spiral early is now the same system keeping him accountable to staying out of it. His relationship with therapy itself remains complicated. Years earlier, he'd been blunt about rejecting it, telling Gilly Da King and Wallow that a court-ordered session wasn't going to work because the person on the other side of it hadn't lived what he'd lived. Whether that resistance has softened since his release isn't something he's addressed publicly at length, but the structure of his supervised release doesn't really give him a choice anymore. Evaluations are mandatory. Counseling is mandatory. The system has essentially forced the exact intervention his lawyer once argued house arrest was preventing him from getting. Career-wise, the pause button clearly didn't stay pressed for long. Even during his sentence, he managed to release a mixtape built from leaked material, keeping his name active in a genre that moves fast enough to forget artists who go quiet for even a few months. Since coming home, chatter about a tour and new studio material has only grown louder, with people close to his camp describing new music as locked in almost as soon as he touched down from the halfway house. For an artist who built an entire fan base on volume and consistency, dropping albums and mixtapes at a pace most artists can't sustain. Reclaiming that rhythm matters just as much for his mental state as it does for his bank account. There's also the matter of public perception, which has shifted in ways that are hard to quantify, but easy to notice. Rumors that once dominated the conversation, the herpes claims, the skin lesion speculation, the what disease does, he have search trend that spiked across social platforms for years, have quieted considerably since his release. Part of that is simply the news cycle moving on, but part of it, based on the visual comparisons fans have circulated, seems tied to an actual physical change. Healthier weight, clearer skin, a steadier presence in photos and live streams. None of it comes with a diagnosis attached, and he's never sat down for a formal medical interview laying out exactly what he was dealing with during the worst of it. But the visual evidence, stacked next to years of documented depression, anxiety, and weight loss, tells its own story about where he was and where he seems to be now. His godmother, Kyrie Garcia, pushed back publicly during the height of his legal troubles on how the public was framing him, saying she wanted people to see Kentrell as a human being rather than just a headline. That framing matters more now than it did then. The headlines used to be about arrests and hospital speculation. Now they're about a man rebuilding a household, a body, a career, all at once, under supervision, but rebuilding nonetheless. Financially, the fallout from his legal troubles wasn't cheap. Between fines tied to his gun charges and the costs associated with the prescription fraud case, he's paid tens of thousands of dollars in penalties on top of legal fees that likely stretch into 7 figures across multiple cases spanning several states. None of that stopped the music revenue, and none of it stopped the tour buzz. If anything, the financial hit seems to have sharpened his focus on getting back to work as fast as his supervised release terms will allow. Nearly a year removed from that federal facility in Alabama, the version of him circulating on social media looks almost unrecognizable. Next to the man fans were worried about in 2023, the armed guards are still stationed outside the Utah property. The supervised release clock is still ticking, with years left before those 5 years of monitoring, screenings, and counseling requirements expire. But the day-to-day picture has changed in ways that go beyond just physical. Appearance, he's still making music constantly. That part of him never really paused. Not through house arrest, not through federal prison, not through a halfway house transfer. What's changed is the environment around the music. Where he used to record from inside a house, he couldn't legally leave, isolated from collaborators and limited to 3 approved visitors. He's now operating with something closer to normal. Creative freedom, even with the restrictions still technically in place. The health questions that once dominated every headline about him haven't fully disappeared, but they've shifted in tone. Nobody's circulating leaked photos speculating about internal bleeding anymore. Nobody's screenshotting cryptic Instagram captions from his cat's account begging for help. The conversation has moved from crisis to recovery, even if the full medical picture of what he actually went through during those years under house arrest has never been laid out in a formal, on-record way. He's never given an interview that says explicitly, "Here's what was wrong with me, and here's how I fixed it." What exists instead is a pattern. Years of documented depression, weight loss, and physical decline, followed by federally mandated sobriety, forced routine, and a visibly different presence once he came home. His family situation continues to grow and shift, with a household built around multiple children and relationships that predate all of this legal chaos. Fatherhood, by every account, from people close to him, remains one of the few constants that stayed stable while almost everything else in his life has been in flux. Arrests, court dates, prison transfers, halfway houses, curfews. Kids don't pause for any of that, and neither, it seems, has his role as a parent. The tour talk that started circulating right after his release still hasn't fully materialized into a locked schedule as of now, but the groundwork people close to him described: new material, renewed studio energy, a camp that's clearly positioning for a comeback stretch, suggests it's less a question of if than when. For an artist whose entire identity was built on relentless output, silence was always the bigger threat than any individual legal case. He's avoided that silence, even at his lowest points, and that instinct hasn't changed now that he's free. What's left is a supervised release period that runs for years. Mandatory counseling sessions he can't skip, screenings that will keep tracking whether the sobriety that seems to have followed him out of federal custody actually holds. The system built specifically around concerns for his mental and physical health is still watching, still checking in, still holding him to terms that exist precisely because of everything documented in the years leading up to his sentencing. Whether that monitoring becomes the thing that finally keeps him stable, or just another set of conditions he eventually chafes against the way he once chafed against house arrest, is the part of this story that hasn't been written yet. For now, though, the man behind the armed gates in Utah looks like someone who survived something. The weight is back, the skin looks clearer, the music hasn't stopped, and a household full of kids gives him a reason, every single day, to keep showing up as something more stable than the version of himself the world was worried about just a few years ago. Prison didn't fix everything. Freedom hasn't erased the supervision, but somewhere between the cell and the mansion, something in his life actually changed. And for the first time in a long time, it changed for the better.